So apparently, today is the 1st of November, and October just went. And I honestly hadn't realized that. I hadn't realized it until yesterday when I looked into my calendar because I was going to just write the date of the service on top of my notes. I'm like, oh, I should write the date here. Like, oh man, 1st of November. So I hadn't really realized that time had gotten that quick, even though I had seen signs. When I went to the supermarket on Friday, I remember thinking the year is coming to an end because I noticed the significant increase in Christmas stuff. Right? Suddenly, flöte has, julenisse on it. And you're like, oh yeah, Christmas is coming. And to be honest, I often get annoyed by this, by stores pushing Christmas on us so early. Because sometimes by the time that we actually come to Christmas, we can be a bit sick of it all already, right? Of the whole thing, of the same jazzy Christmas songs that we hear in absolutely every shop that we go into, and the Christmas themes on everything from chocolates to toilet paper. Everything suddenly has Christmas themes on it. And I guess at least this year we get to choose our own soundtrack because I guess a lot of us are going to be buying our stuff online and not crowding stores. But even though I get annoyed with that, the truth is I love Christmas, and Christmas is a big deal in our home. So I figured that rather than fight this early spirit of the season, I decided to go along with it, and I started planning for this year's Christmas pageant. You all know what a Christmas pageant is. It's like a play, right, with a nativity scene. Often you'll see it at schools or churches, and you have little kids dressed up like sheep or wrapped in their bed sheets to make very accurate first century Palestine clothing, right? Because apparently that's what they used back then, your mother's sheet. Right, you see, and they make the whole scene. So I would like to share with you my idea for this year's Christmas pageant, okay? Christmas play. So imagine the stage. Imagine the stage. Then onto the stage comes Mary. No donkeys, no Joseph and stuff, just Mary, and she's dressed with a bright yellow robe, like really bright, like those shirts that they would wear in the 90s, right? And she's super pregnant, of course, because it's Christmas. So she walks onto the stage with this super bright yellow robe, and as soon as she comes on stage, she starts screaming with birth pains. And she walks onto the stage and she's screaming with birth pains, and then another actor comes on stage, and this actor is dressed like an enormous dragon. And not a nice dragon, it's not Falkor. This is a red, enormous, humongous dragon, and it has 7 heads with horns, and it's wearing crowns on each of the heads, and it comes and it positions itself in front of Mary in such a way that it's obvious to those watching that it intends to devour the child as soon as it's born. And then there's a moment of tension. Are you seeing this on the stage? There's a moment of tension, right? But as soon as the baby is born, it just zooms up, pulled by a cable or something from the top of the stage, right? Just and then suddenly a whole lot of other actors come on the stage, and they're dressed as angels. And they start fighting the dragon, and they throw him off the stage. And then a huge banner falls, right? Green and red, and it says, "Merry Christmas!" And everybody starts singing, "Silent Night." What do you think? You think that's going to work? Of course, I have a confession to make. There's some level of plagiarism on my part. That story is not originally mine. I did add the banner and the Silent Night song in the end because that's what makes it an authentic Christmas pageant. But I actually got the idea from John the Seer. We have for a while now been looking at the book which John wrote, which we have come to call the book of Revelation, the last book in the Bible. And if you have been following this series with us, or if you have read Revelation before, you will know that it is full of this weird imagery of dragons and angels and horses with colors and whatnot. And you might also remember that when we started this series, we talked about a couple of things that we need to know about the book of Revelation. And there were several things, but one thing that we emphasize was that the book of Revelation is overwhelmingly, insistently, and unequivocally about Jesus Christ. About Jesus Christ. And this is super important. Jesus is the central theme, and he is the rudder for the whole ship. Unless you keep that rudder in place, the whole thing goes adrift. Another thing that we said that we need to know is that the goal of the book of Revelation is primarily pastoral. Primarily pastoral. John, to say it in a different way, John had real living Christian communities in mind. And he had real Christian communities and people in heart when he was writing this. And so I believe did the Spirit who gives the vision. Real Christian communities living in real life. Keeping these two things in mind is very helpful when going into this section of the book that I want to talk about today. And that's chapters 12 through 14 for those of you who are keeping track and want to check. And it's in the beginning of chapter 12 that we find the material that I use for my Christmas pageant. So John, calling it a great sign in heaven, he describes a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She's pregnant. And she's crying in birth pain as a new sign appears, an enormous red dragon. And the dragon takes its stand to devour the child as he's born. As I said, for it is a son, right? A son that is born. And one that, John says, will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. And then he says, her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. There are a couple of elements here. One of them being this whole iron scepter thing is a reference to Psalm 2, which is a highly messianic psalm. And there are several elements that allow us to recognize that John is essentially retelling the birth of Jesus on a cosmological stage. John has a thing with telling about Jesus' birth in a different way than everybody else. He tells it differently in the beginning of the gospel, and here he comes back to it, right? He's retelling the birth of Jesus, but he's setting it on a cosmological, eternal stage. But it's not enough to recognize that John is doing that. We need to ask why. Why is he doing this? And I want to read for you what John tells us in just after, right? In the wake of the birth of the child, right after. And I encourage you to actually just listen, taking it in with your hearing and with your active imagination, because that's how most early receivers of this writing of John would have received it, right? Would have heard it and would have taken it in. When we read, we read so much, right? So when we read, we tend to rush ahead or keep looking back and not allowing ourselves to just witness the story. If you absolutely feel like you must read, then this is Revelation 12. I'm going to read from verses 7 to 17. Then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, "Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our brothers and sisters, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been hurled down. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them, but woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. he is filled with fury because he knows that his time is short. When the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness, where she would be taken care of for a time, times and a half, and a time out of the serpent's reach. Then from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river to overtake the woman and sweep her away with the torrent. But the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. Those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. Those early recipients of John's writings, those churches that John had in his heart, even as he sat imprisoned on the island of Patmos, they would have recognized themselves in these words. Not only as those who hold fast to the testimony of Jesus, but as those who do that under the rage of the dragon. Holding fast to the testimony of Jesus meant for them stepping away from the religious status quo, which at that time meant stepping away from the political status quo. And it meant exposing oneself to the violence of the empire. As the gospel at that time went beyond the confines of Israel and beyond the confines of the first Jewish followers of Jesus, Christians were losing their public identification as a Jewish minority. And with that move, they were also losing the specific rights and protections that were conceded specifically to the Jews. So now, no longer being in the category of Jews, but of non-Jews, they were expected to take part in the cult of imperial worship, which was demanded at that time in the Roman Empire. And they refused. And so they came on the receiving end of the wrath of the Roman Empire. Being a Christian meant losing rights and very likely losing life. They were being legally, religiously, and physically persecuted, often by violent means. They strived to hold on to their faith. But this was a second generation of believers. Most of them were not eyewitnesses. They had believed through hearing the stories. And now, faced with the power and the violence of the Roman Empire, faced with the temptation to cave, with the temptation to conciliate their faith either to the standards of Judaism or Rome at the expense of the gospel, faced with the surmounting weight of the present times they were living in, what did those stories of the past, of a boy born among animals in a village outside Jerusalem, later crucified like a lowly criminal, what did those stories have to say? What did they matter? So John retells the story. It's the same story, but he shifts the focus. He zooms out to cosmic, eternal levels. And he does that so that he may tell those churches that the baby in the manger is the tip of a cosmological iceberg that sinks the whole ship of evil and death. And this zooming out that John does, this zooming out of time, it has a double effect. On one hand, it assures the relevance and it assures the victory of the gospel. It tells them the ancient serpent is defeated. Salvation and the kingdom of God have come. Now have come the salvation and the power. But at the same time, it also acknowledges that we are within time. Even as it zooms out of it, it recognizes that we are within it. John isn't dismissing their suffering and their reality. He is offering perspective. He isn't telling them that it doesn't matter because the victory is won on the heavenly realms. No, he is telling them that precisely because the victory is won, it does matter. And it's worth holding fast the testimony of their faith. The imagery of Revelation is not a flight from reality. It is a dive deeper into reality. John is encouraging them to remain faithful in a world where the coming of Christ brings salvation, it brings the first fruits of the kingdom, but it also excites evil. And John deals with the reality of evil. And he deals with the reality of evil in the context of the vision as well, where evil is personalized as the dragon, and it tries to destroy Christ, but it cannot. So it goes for the church, for those who keep the testimony. And in this vision, this attack of the dragon comes in the form of two beasts. And both beasts act on behalf of the dragon, and they all work together like a kind of an unholy trinity. The first beast comes out of the sea. It has 10 horns and 7 heads and 10 crowns on its horns, each head bearing a blasphemous name. Its resemblance is in this assemblage of animals, and this beast receives the power, authority, and throne of the dragon. And the whole world follows the beast and is in wonder of it. The language is important here. More images and descriptions are used for it, but suffice it to say that this beast is the beast of political and military power, of manipulative politics and of oppressive politics that uses force to attract admiration and uses force to enforce obedience to it, and uses force and violence to frighten the followers of Christ into disobeying their Lord. For those early Christians, it was inevitable to think of Rome. But this kind of beast, it didn't die with the fall of the Roman Empire. To resist it calls for, in the words of John, patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people. The second beast comes out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. And through great signs and wonders, it deceived the inhabitants of the earth into worshiping the first beast and honoring it. This is the beast of religious power and manipulation. It looks like a lamb, a counterfeit to Christ, but it speaks like a dragon. It gives the people a mark to carry on their hands and on their foreheads, but it is not the Shema that the Jewish people carried on their phylacteries in these same places, which they would tie on their hands and on their faces as a sign and as a memory to remind them, the Lord our God is one Lord, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. But this isn't the Shema. This is a counterfeit. Rather than a mark speaking of God, it is a mark emphasizing man. 666, without going further into all the wild theories around this number, it is 3 times the number of humankind. If resisting the first beast called for endurance and faithfulness, resisting this beast calls for wisdom. Because this beast comes dressed in pious religious clothing. It looks like a lamb, and it performs signs and wonders. but it forces its worship upon all that it can, by all means that it can. And the mark that it carries is ultimately about humankind for its own sake and self-serving ambition and for its own destruction. These are the beasts that assail those who would be faithful to Christ. The political military power that manipulates and oppresses and enforces, and the religious power that manipulates and deceives, counterfeiting images of the Lamb and of ourselves. There's a hidden irony here, by the way, because these beasts in their description would remind the Jewish reader of Leviathan and Behemoth, which were mythical creatures of the Jewish scriptures that already had been overpowered by God. So again, John is giving a nudge to the victory. But interestingly, the image that John chooses next to contrast the beasts and their work of death is of a different kind. In contrast to the pressure to cave in, John shows the real Lamb of God surrounded by a perfect number of faithful witnesses in worship. In contrast to the deceit of the beasts, he tells us of 3 angels proclaiming the gospel, declaring the defeat of evil, and warning about the beasts. And then, in a resounding answer to hope, John presents us with the harvest of the world. The Son of Man, seated on the clouds, commands the harvest, and as the grapes are gathered and thrown into the winepress of God's wrath, where they are trampled and blood flows out, we find out that the winepress is outside the city. And with that expression, we have traveled from Bethlehem to Golgotha. From the baby born into poverty and danger to the Christ hanging on the cross of criminals on the cursed hill outside of Jerusalem. These are the stories that the beasts would oppress into either shame or irrelevance. Stories of the birth and the death of Jesus. But these are the stories that become the bookends of this cosmic battle where the dragon is defeated and the beasts destroyed. I have rushed through a lot of content here. And we could spend hours just speaking about the beasts and the harvest and the 144,000 and all of that stuff. But it is what John does to the gospel that I want to focus on today. He makes it extremely present, supremely relevant, and always speaking. He reminds them that the birth of Jesus was nothing less than the coming of the kingdom of God, and that his death was nothing less than the ultimate blow to all that is evil. John insists that we don't forget. And he insists that it is relevant to a lived life in the presence and struggle with evil that we remember that it is ultimately defeated. John is telling those churches of Asia Minor in the first century, and he's telling us that the story of Jesus was their story on that very day. It was happening in their lives and realities because it happens on a cosmic stage as well as in that stable in Bethlehem and that cross in Golgotha. It bears, good job. It bears on history always. bears on history always. It is a story of yesterday that defines today and that shapes tomorrow. It is a story of yesterday that defines today and shapes tomorrow. And so I find myself asking, how are we retelling the story? How are we retelling the story? I guess many of you will have heard about the British street artist and political activist known as Bansky. Bansky owns a hotel in Bethlehem, opposite the Israeli West Bank barrier. And a few years ago, he set up a nativity scene in that hotel. So he set this up in Bethlehem, just opposite the West Bank barrier. It's a powerful image. It's a powerful image that invites us to think about how we tell the story. And quite independently about how each of us might position ourselves in regards to the political turmoil of the Israeli-Palestine conflict, we should never become insensitive to the reality of violence and the scar that it makes on the lives of all involved. To set up a clean, sanitized nativity scene that is oblivious to the reality into which the story is told would be a travesty of the Word who becomes flesh and makes his dwelling among us. The story is told for those who suffer under the weight of evil, and story is real and present for that reality. Several years ago, when Carol and I were recently married, she spent a month in Cochabamba in Bolivia doing some voluntary work in a health project. And while she was there, she bought a nativity scene, which we still use on Christmas to this day. And the interesting thing about that nativity scene is that everybody in it looks Bolivian. Mary, Joseph, the shepherds, Jesus, they are all dressed in traditional Bolivian attire and have Bolivian faces. And I wonder if Jesus has for us a face of the present or a face of the past. A face of the here or a face of the there and then. It cannot be a face for the future if it is not a face for the present. The Jesus stuck in the pages of our Bibles and neatly placed in our static nativity scenes is the Jesus that ends up used for manipulation in the religious and the political spheres. Is the Jesus that only has a corner of our lives and of our houses. But the Jesus whose birth and resurrection are a present reality for those who live faithfully in the face of evil and injustice. That is the Lamb that defeats the dragon and sends the beasts packing. How do we tell the story? To ourselves and to the world around us. John tells us that God is profoundly interested and involved with what is going on in the world. And he tells us that the birth of Jesus on this day is profoundly interested and invested on what happens in the world and in our lives. And so also his death. and resurrection. What stories do we tell? And who are we in them? May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord turn his face towards each and every one of you into the very story of your lives, and may he give you peace. Go in peace and serve the Lord joyfully.